I'd like to share a little bit about what Singapore is working on, and you can clearly tell from the outset that I am not Singaporean, but I've lived in Singapore a long time, 16, 17 years. I've spent my whole career building hardware and software technology companies, 10 years living in London with the Europe, Middle East, and Africa portfolio, and 17 years now in Asia. And because I'd lived in Singapore a long time, Singapore government about 4 years ago offered me the opportunity to be a part of leading the technology agency for Singapore government. At the end of that 3-year term, I was so excited about what we're doing with entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship that I asked for the opportunity to set up a new entity focusing specifically and solely on entrepreneurs and their journey. We're not working for investors, we're not working for government, we're not working for the universities, we're not working for corporates. The only people that we want to serve and to work with are the entrepreneurs. And everybody else in that ecosystem is important as part of that entrepreneurship journey, but our customer is the entrepreneur. And that's important because that's how we look at measuring things. I'll just use a couple of things to paint a picture. We see that Singapore is a place that's built on innovation. We have no natural water supply. We have no places to grow lots of hectares of food, et cetera, et cetera. So everything that we've been trying to do in Singapore is innovation-oriented. We've had to think about land reclamation. We've had to think about bringing things into Singapore that created an economic engine. What was our customer? How did we think about being a player in the global economy? So Singapore has had to solve important problems. If you think back from the late 50s, early 60s, Singapore was essentially a fishing port and is now on a GDP basis one of the world's highest per capita. So we think about innovation as something which is important to us. But we have some challenges, and those are shared challenges around the world. Everybody's becoming more densely populated. I just use a comparison wherever I go to give a little bit of context. Now, clearly, we think that Sweden is a big place because Sweden is 10 million people. We think that's a pretty impressive number. But when we think about it on a space perspective, clearly we've got an urban density challenge that Sweden and other places do not. So I was in Hong Kong last week. Hong Kong is 4th in the world. We're 3rd in the world. That's not necessarily a great metric to want to be first, but we're densely populated, just under 8,000 people per square kilometer. And there isn't anywhere else to go. The island is the island, so there's no place to go and get away. So we have to think about this because it has implications on a lot of different areas. Aging population. Again, another shared problem or opportunity, which is there's going to be more people above the age of 65 in the years ahead than below the age of 5. And so there's this complete inversion of the demographics of the world. And so now you need to think about a different healthcare paradigm. We don't necessarily want people going and sitting in doctors' offices and waiting to see the doctor. We'd love to have people cared for as much as we can from their home. And we'd like to think about hospitals purely as an emergency or acute care facility. The longer you live, the more chronic conditions that afflict you, and you can continue to live for years and years with those. But we're trying to think about what that means to us in terms of a healthcare model. So we take a look at a flatlining generally of some of these birth rates. That's a challenge for us in terms of replacement, but we think about an aging population. So here's what we're really concerned about. And the reason that I share these is that these are the same things that everybody in the world's concerned about. There isn't a place that I've been that we don't think about these same issues. That's important because when we think about entrepreneurship and innovation and research and education, we wanted it to have a purpose. And this purpose is to try and tackle some of these problems. So the team with which I work is not trying to build mobile applications. We're not trying to build e-commerce websites. Those things are cool and they create economic value, but we are trying to solve problems that we think matter to a lot of people, including to Singapore. So let me share a couple of things. We like to measure ourselves in some of these areas. So we like to think about the things that we're first in, and for those that know Singapore, this is especially important to us, which is a challenge, by the way, in terms of mindset. But these are all the great things that Singapore is ranked number 1. But the question is, okay, we might have the best test scores in the world, we might have the most economically ready environment, might have the most digitally enabled environment, But the question we're asking ourselves is, so what? It's been important to us to try and have these things as mile markers and benchmarks, but the question that we're trying to be very transparent and honest about is, so what? What can we do with it? We're really good at chasing those outcomes. We're less good at understanding what we can do to create something from it. That's the big rotation in Singapore, as it is in a lot of markets. What can we do to create some economic value from these things? Here's the question that we're trying to ask ourselves. For those that have read Jason Ponton's work in MIT's Technology Review, there's some really interesting dynamics here. Why are investors putting money into things that are going to be easily replicated, things that can be copied by a lot of people, or clones? Why can't we solve some really important problems? In Singapore, we tend to think of ourselves as we are not big enough to solve an important problem. We don't have enough engineers to solve an important problem. There's a long list of things. So part of what we do is we're trying to turn that into a, well, why can't we? As opposed to explaining why we can't, we're trying to challenge ourselves. Research and innovation is not a constraint for us. We're very thankful that we have the opportunity to put a significant amount of money. We have a long-term commitment to it. I can stand in front of you and say next year and the year after and the year after, it will be what it will be, because that's something that Singapore government puts a lot of pride and commitment to. So again, the question has to be asked, okay, that's great that there's a lot of research going on. What can we do to create economic value for it? And again, how does it have a purpose? We just announced something the other week. The minister for whom I was working just announced another tranche of money specifically targeted this time only at those things associated with AI. Natural language processing, computer vision, how do we think about turning robotics into something useful? So we're targeting these, but again, a global challenge, and I hope there's things that we can talk about working on together. But here's the thing that we're worried about, and I use this just as a way of explaining what we're concerned about. So we're going along quickly, everything's great, and then we get into this, right? So the reason that that's relevant is we're very concerned in Singapore about things that don't go well. We're very concerned about those things, which becomes a limitation. And so our challenge is we know how to do things, but at the same time, if we're not certain that those things can work out well, we become uncomfortable about tackling them. And it's hard to do new things if you don't tackle things that you don't already know how to do. And so for us, the challenge of not knowing that we will be able to keep going straight ahead, that there might be a turn, that we might need to slow down, makes us feel uncomfortable. And therefore, going into some new areas and really pushing is something that we're always having to struggle with. That's part of the reason that my team exists, is to continue to push people and encourage people that might otherwise say, well, what if there's a curve? And the answer is, okay, what if there's a curve? We need to be okay at saying, yep, you came off the bike, but you can get back on, you can keep going. It wasn't something that should stop you forever. And if you let that concern get in the way of doing anything, then you won't do something amazing. So we've had the Deputy Prime Minister over to our place for the simple reason that we wanted to have all the young men and women in Singapore that say, does government care about what I'm doing? And we wanted them to say, okay, if someone like the Deputy Prime Minister, who's been in Sweden and is currently involved in a lot of things with IMF and World Bank, if he cares about what I'm doing, then we must be onto something. And we make sure that there's lots of selfies taken with the DPM and the young men and women, and then they can go home and show their parents. And the answer is, in an Asian culture, knowing that you have face or honor is important. And having that picture with the Deputy Prime Minister when you could have had a job at Goldman Sachs working in analytics matters. So if you want to go start a data science company with 2 of your teammates from university, and somebody thinks that that's not as important as working at a bank, having a picture with a DPM and saying, I'm believing in what you're doing. So we do a lot. We have a lot of ministers over to our place to take a lot of selfies. We had Prince Andrew from the royal family, UK. So my team was sending me WhatsApps all through the morning. We had Prince Andrew over to our place earlier today because he's in Singapore visiting some people. And he came by and walked around and said hello to some of the men and women. We do that specifically and only because we want to encourage that they're onto something important and amazing. Right? We don't know where it leads, but we do a lot of that. So that's what we're trying to do. SGInnovate, which is a team that I've set up, is itself a startup, and we had the DPM say that very specifically because some of my government colleagues will say, how are you measured? Why are you able to get away with these things? Why don't you have the same sort of metrics that we do? So we asked the DPM to say, these folks are actually trying to do something different, and we don't know where it will lead, but that's okay. So here's what we define ourselves as doing. We want to enable ambitious and capable men and women, and we say those because a lot of people are ambitious, but not necessarily capable. A lot of people are capable and have little ambition, so we want to work with people that are both, and we want to enable them to work on something that's technology intensive, something that's difficult to recreate, something that's difficult to clone. We want it to have value, durability, and we want to do something that matters for the world. It's not our intent to do something for Singapore. We want to do something from Singapore, but for a bigger market, something that matters, makes a difference. And we want to build on the research IP. So that's the link. We put a lot of money into research, and what we're saying is, that's great. Let's go build something. Here's how we define ourselves. We put money to work, so we're an investor. We help people acquire customers. We don't do the selling, but we make a call to somebody of influence. So we'll call the head of cybersecurity at one of the telcos and say, we've got two amazing young men and women, you should meet them. They're working on something that might make a difference for your business. Give them 10 minutes, please, and they will. And there's no way that a two-person, no-name company will see the chief of cybersecurity at a major telco. But we can help make that introduction happen, and we do. And we don't do that in Singapore only, we do that in a lot of different markets. We do that in San Francisco, we do that in London, we do that in Tel Aviv, we do that in China. So what we're trying to do is just give an open door and a fighting chance. That's it. Increase the odds. That's all of our goal. Give them visibility, coach them, put money to work. We've been up and running for about 6 months. We've got a lot of things that we're working on. We've had thousands of people at different events. We don't measure it based on whether we have 5,000 versus 7,000, but it's just a data point that says that it's not 50. And what we're trying to do is have AI, blockchain, autonomous vehicles, and so on. Things that we think are important and exciting. And what we want to do is just build community, have people be interested, excited, engaged, involved in things that are difficult and important, as opposed to just saying, any startup is cool. What we're trying to do is to say, working on things that other people don't know how to work on is cool, right? Anybody can set up a shop. All of us could go set up a business by this afternoon. But setting up something that could make a big difference to people's lives, that's pretty cool. And we put money to work. In the last 6 months, we've invested in 14 early-stage companies. We'll put money to work in another 15 or so by the end of this year. It's just optionality. We believe in investing in great men and women. Whether it's this company or a different company, we just like to work with great people. And we hope that a few of these companies actually go the distance, of course. But we do want to be active. So we have industrial wastewater purification. We have Internet of Things encryption. We have people that are working on satellite laser communications, different things. And here's the team. We have about 45 or 50 people with whom we work. They're our direct teammates, my direct teammates. And then we have people outside that are a part of our extended network. VCs, universities, corporates, government. And so that's what we're seeking to do. Help people make a difference on a big scale. And we believe a lot in the power of networks. So we'd love to work with anybody and everybody that wants to do something that's going to make a difference on a big scale. Thank you very much.
I have to ask you a couple of few questions. Well, you can also sort of add questions via the app for Stephen. And we might pick up some now or some later in the panel. So, but how much? What is your budget? You said you invested in 14 companies. Do you have a fund, or do you have operating? What's the setup with sort of the budget and the fund to invest in? So.
We don't think about it as a fund because we have 2 sovereign wealth funds from within Singapore that are on our board, and we have a whole ecosystem of VCs. So we have our own budget of investment money. I don't discuss it publicly, but it's in the tens of millions range.
It's enough.
it's enough. And the fact that we have people on our board that represent tens of billions means that if we are fortunate enough to have something go, we have plenty of people that can write the bigger checks. But we tend to put money in at the 50,000 to 1 million range. We want to help people, 1 million US, we want to help people get off the ground. So we think of it as an airplane going down the runway. We want to help them reach enough speed to get the nose wheel off the runway, ideally the rear wheels off. But then our job is essentially done. We're not trying to fly the plane. We're not trying to take them on a long distance flight. We're trying to get them off the ground, and then the private sector will do what the private sector will do.
Lost my train of thought there. But do we have any questions on there for? Not so far. Okay. Well, but yeah. But your role, how do you connect with all the other actors? So, what do you see this as a complement, or are you becoming a competitor to the ones that are already active in Singapore?
I think the only difference is everybody knows everybody, just like they would in Stockholm, or just like they would in Berlin or San Diego. Everybody knows everybody, and so part of the reason that I do this role or do this job is because I know a lot of people in and around the ecosystem. So we can always call, and sort of my teammates, we can always call an investor. They send us notes, WhatsApp groups, and so on. The university people. So we go to a lot of the same events. We see each other in the same environments. And if there's ever any concern about friction, then we just sit face to face and talk about it for 10 minutes. So we're not perfect in the sense that there'll be some part of government that will say, shouldn't we do that? And we always say, great. If you want to, that's fine. What we try to do is out-hustle. We try and know more people. We try and do more things for the entrepreneurs. So we just try and define ourselves like anybody would. Do we add more value to what it is that that entrepreneur is trying to do than anyone else? Just like if we're in a commercial world. Nobody gives you a franchise and says there's no competition. So we want to be more valuable to those entrepreneurs than any other choice they have. And if they have another choice that's better than us, they should take it. So we look at that competition as a healthy thing in an ecosystem, as long as we don't do something harmful to the entrepreneur by over-competing or trying to over-flood the market with money and service, which just has a dilution effect.
One final question from my side. So you said you're focusing not on sort of apps and those kind of things. You really want to go deep tech.
Yeah, we want to work on those things. Our basic premise is, if anybody in the room can do it, then we probably aren't interested. And we say that with a straight face because our goal is any research environment, any scientific environment, there's always going to be that 2 or 3% of people that have the capability and have always wondered if they can do something that might bring their work to a global audience. And those are the people with whom we want to work, and those are the people that we want to try and do everything we can to increase their odds of succeeding. Other than that, there's plenty of other people that can help a startup get off the ground that will put $100,000 in and keep their fingers crossed. That's not our goal. Our goal is to work on something that is medical, is transportation, is public safety, is energy, those things that matter on a multi-country global scale.
Okay, we have a few questions come up. We can take one, then we'll... Do you see? So it's you can choose one of these three. What's the difference between the difference between and value of competition, collaboration, innovation, role of governments?
I mean, to me, I don't care on any. I can pick all of them, but to me, the global instability question I think is an important one, simply because just like my friends in London right now are trying to understand what this means for their technology environment. London was on a great roll. And there's a big entrepreneurship event tomorrow in London. And of course, they're going to be debating what does this whole thing mean, this whole Brexit and leadership challenge. Then you have North America, you have other parts of Asia. Everybody going through this scenario of change is not terribly helpful when you start talking about long-term planning. So one of the things that I'm very thankful for in terms of the Singapore environment is this idea that I know research money will be there. I know investment money will be there. I know the educational framework will be there. I know the immigration framework will be there. So we can go out and speak with people about machine learning and computer vision and the future of health with confidence because we know that we can stick with the promises we make. In a lot of other environments, the answer is you make a deal, you agree with somebody, and then 6 or 8 or 12 months later, it comes unwound because somebody else is sitting in that chair. That's pretty difficult to plan around. So global instability, forget about any one country or nation, I think is discouraging for collectively all of us because we have some really important things to work on. There simply are important challenges in energy and health and housing, and all of these scenarios are not going to be easier, they're going to be more difficult. And I wish that we could get a little bit of stability in multiple countries just so that we can work on these really tough problems before they become a bigger crisis. So for me, that has a significant challenge. In my own small patch of the world, I'm thankful to keep eyes on the horizon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So we will now make a leap. We do the Star Trek thing to beam us up and beam us up from Singapore to Berlin. And I would like to welcome Thomas Meißner. He's the director at Berlin Partner for Business and Technology. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I thank you very much for the invitation. And I feel very honored to have the opportunity to present to you some of our findings on our innovation strategy and to share some experiences we made so far. First of all, just a few words on my organization, Berlin Partner for Business and Technology. This is a private company, but it is not this private company, but owned by the public. So we are working on public behalf. We are supporting the Berlin Senate, the Berlin regional government, with not just. Oh, yeah, it's just on my computer. Sorry, I didn't recognize that this is not on the big screens. So, but anyhow, we are working on behalf of the Berlin Senate in order to support companies and scientific institutes to improve their business and to be more innovative in the future. So, and once the slide is coming, you can see 5 columns. And 2 of them are very relevant to the innovation strategy. This is cluster management, where we organize the innovation strategy on behalf of the Berlin Senate. And the other one is technology transfer, where we try to put together scientific institutes and the companies. But there's also one point I would like to highlight, and this is close linked to what Stephen just presented. Berlin is also a hotspot for startup companies. And therefore, the support of the startup ecosystem is becoming more and more important for our work. And this is close linked with the innovation strategy, of course, and it's become more and more important for our activities. Okay, it's coming slowly, but surely. Okay, the original, since the 20 minutes are running, so okay, now we are on the right slide. The original basis was given by some EU-financed studies already 15 years ago. This was a starting point in which the most relevant areas were defined. This was biotechnology at that time. It was ICT and it was transport systems. And based on that, we tried to bring together the Berlin and the Brandenburg. Brandenburg is the surrounding Bundesland of Berlin. We tried to bring these innovation approaches together to form a joint innovation strategy. You can see here some milestones. We started 2007 with identification of our future fields, and then finally in 2011 we have a decision by the Berlin Senate and the Brandenburg ministries to launch this this joint innovation strategy for the both, for Berlin and for Brandenburg. And that's a good example, I guess, to what was mentioned already this morning by the Ericsson colleague, that we should have coalitions between urban and rural areas. So, and this is one example for that. So nowadays, this is our basic thematic structure. We have 5 clusters. One is healthcare or life science. One is energy technology, transport, mobility, and logistics. We have ICT and creative industry. and we have a smaller one, which is the photonics area. And we have some horizontal topics which are important for all of these clusters. On the technology side, you can see them here, new materials, for example, or clean technologies. And we have some more non-technical elements that are also important for all these clusters. For example, internationalization, and knowledge transfer, and how to organize marketing for the clusters, for example. This is the basic structure we are now living for a couple of years. And of course, there are some challenges we were confronted at the beginning, but some of these challenges still exist. So the identification of the most promising areas, this was of course very crucial at the beginning. And this is still a stable, I would say, a stable portfolio we have. Strategy for each of the clusters. All of the clusters, meanwhile, have a master plan that is giving some guidelines for the activities for the next years. And this is important because everybody inside the clusters was invited to take part. And there was a big interest to take part, to bring in their own points and to profit from all these activities defined in the strategy. Establish a well-balanced governance structure. Of course, we are dealing with public money. That means reporting is very important. But this must not dominate the cluster management activities. So we must balance that. How to motivate companies and institutes to contribute to the cluster work. So there is no need to put money in the system by them. But of course, if you engage yourself, commit yourself to cluster activities, then you have to invest in capacities and personnel and time and resources. And that is sometimes difficult for the small and medium enterprises. So we need long-term funding of cluster management activities. It's not a matter of political terms or legislative terms. You need sometimes you need a long breath to say so. Verification of the impact is not so easy. I will come back on this a little bit later. So this is our cluster structure in some basic figures. So the clusters are rather big, as you can see, except photonics maybe, but the others are big. So this is more or less 1/3 of the Berlin and Brandenburg economy. So this is, of course, too big to involve all of them into cluster activities and innovation activities. You must see this as an offer. So if you are a company in the life science area, you are invited to take part, but this is, of course, not compulsory. So you can use all the offers that was given by the cluster management and be engaged, but this is not a need. So it is not an exclusive club, it is an open system, to say so. Of course, in each of the clusters, we have a core of very active companies and institutes that rely on these activities, but of course not all of them. This is the governance structure. We have on the political constitution on the top, we have an annual innovation summit involving a lot of people. We have a steering board also coming together once a year. And most important for the day-to-day work is a cluster management structure. So we have a cluster speaker for each of the clusters representing the whole area, and we have professional teams coming from my organization and from our sister organization from Brandenburg that are doing the day-to-day work. A cluster manager plus a number of experts that are used to network and to support for the initiation of projects. So this is what the cluster actors, the companies and the institutes expect, and this is what we know from them. And I listed some of these most important topics here. Transparency is important. Important is better utilization of cross-cutting technologies. That is what they expect from cluster activities. And probably the two most important are the involvement into future-looking R&D projects and the opportunity to establish long-term trustful partnerships. So that is probably the most important thing. And this is not a matter of a few weeks. This is a matter of years, more or less. So, and we do not replace existing networks with the cluster, but we support them in their activities. So master plan, what is all about? I already said this was an important process to give to all of the cluster a master plan. This was a bottom-up activity where everybody was invited to take part, and this is now stable. So the master plans were defined between 2012 and 2014, and now they are in a revision process. Energy technology is the first one who have worked on a new version. Implementation and budget. I only want to highlight one point. This is the second one. So our innovation strategy is part of the operational program of Berlin and Brandenburg in order to make use of structural funds from the Commission. So half of the money for the cluster activities is coming from Brussels, and the other half is coming from the budgets of the two Bundesländer. So this is important to know, because then that's the reason why we have to stick with the S3 strategy, of course. But this gives us much more scope compared to the situation where we had to finance everything by our regional budgets. So the budget for cluster work is around 4 million euro in Berlin, and almost the same amount on the Brandenburg side. That means it is not the money for projects, it's the money to finance the cluster management activities. If you are looking on projects that were initiated by the cluster management teams, then you will end up with around 300 to 350 million euro in 2016. So there is a big lever behind, of course. So the measuring progress, I already mentioned that with a few words. This is important. We have now two instruments in place. One is more on the top level. This is the cluster monitoring based on official statistics. You've seen the number of employees and the turnover. This is coming from this instrument. And the second one is more looking into technical areas. This is a monitoring which we call impact monitoring, because it's trying to make the link between activities of the cluster management and the long-term impacts, which is difficult, of course. It's not an easy task, and therefore we discussed a lot and came up with a rather complex system. This is just the first level of it, but see the complexity. We had a lot of discussion about it, but now it is in place. And we try to make some change between cluster management activities and the mid-term and long-term activities out of it. So this is in place. This is IT-based, and this had a link to the reporting, so we can drop on push a button and report. More or less a report comes out, or let's say some major statements and some major figures come out by pressing a button. So the reason for that is, or the purpose is not to have a direct control of the cluster management, but to improve our impacts, to have reverse loops in order to improve our things to do, our tasks and our activities, in order to have better impacts for the economic systems. So I just have two examples of projects initiated by cluster management and has some long-term impacts. The first one is on the transport area. This is what I feel a little bit more comfortable, because I'm responsible for the transport cluster in the innovation strategy. So we already discussed about electromobility some 8 to 9 years ago, and first step was to form a kind of model region or pilot region between Berlin and Potsdam, which is the capital of Brandenburg, and then finally came up with a big showcase project that involved more than 80 million euro, more than 100 partners and 30 corp project, and the purpose was to really have critical mass in the introduction of electromobility in the area, and to have a systematic and integrative approach between the energy system, the vehicle technology, and the transport system. So we had 4 showcases in Germany. 3 of them were dominated by the automotive industry. The one in Berlin-Brandenburg not, because we do not have so much automotive industry in our area. So this was more the intermodal approach. You can see some basic figures here. Important to know is that a lot of these activities which were finished in 2016 are now on a stable basis, are moving ahead. and already reached some level of commercialization. So this is important for our long-term impacts, of course. The other one is a younger one. It's just started this year. It's a big program from the energy area, energy technology, how to deal with the German energy Wende, energy shift, you know this famous strategy, but it's not so easy to implement. And one approach from the Ministry for Economy was to launch a couple of big regional projects, how to manage with the support of modern ICT instruments, this big challenge of the energy change from conventional one to renewables. And this is now in place, and the big challenge here was the pre-phase. So you need a long breath in order to establish such a big project and all these things that need to happen before. So the cluster management had to work almost 3 years before launching the submission to the ministry. So normally a private company would not be able to do this, but here it is clear, visible that the cluster management activities has a big advantage to them. So these are some topics to be dealt in with this big project. I would like to come to the last slide, our emerging topics for the future. So we are now looking more, or beginning with this year, we are now looking on the cross-cluster activities. So we have these 5 clusters, but they have so many interconnections that we will make more use of them in the future. Digitalization, of course, this is the enabler for almost everything, and therefore it is a very important subject into all the clusters. Further cross-sectoral subjects as well. Industry 4.0 is also driven by digitalization, safety, security as well. We more and more have open innovation and non-technical innovation. So not so much just looking on the technology side, but also looking on societal innovation and business innovation, of course. Internationalization is a topic, and something which is not listed here is, again, the startup activities. So we see startups more and more as the core of the innovation ecosystem in our region. And that's the reason why we formed a startup alliance with other cities. So far, New York is involved, Shanghai, Tel Aviv, Paris from this week on. And this is very much open to other interested cities and regions in the world. So maybe for Stockholm is of course known as one of the major hubs for startup activities as well, and Singapore as well. So I think we have the potential to bring together the most experienced and the strongest hubs in the startup activities, and to have win-win situation for all of the involved actors. So qualified professional is still a point, and which remains as an important point is to support the industry and the institutes with the development or developing innovation projects. So, and last but not least, the S3 platform highlights smart stories. Some of you know them maybe. Normally 2 stories per member state, and we are very proud that the Berlin-Brandenburg innovation strategy is one of the 2 German examples. There is a lot of rationale given behind on the website. You can read if you are interested. But most important is the motto: a comprehensive process takes time, trust, and confidence. And therefore, I thank you very much for your time.
I mean, it looks from your description, it's been a very fairly long, but also complicated process. So what have been the conflicts to get these clusters and create these sort of cluster engines?
Yeah.
How have you solved the problems, of course?
As I said, at the beginning, there was a discussion how to define the cluster borders, or the core clusters. Some of the German regions and other regions in Europe define cluster as smaller associations where everybody knows everybody, where you have to pay a member fee normally, and where you have the very strong commitment to do everything together, more or less. This is the one approach. The other approach is what we are doing, is more top-down, and look into branches, look into these activities which have a future market, and to make an offer to all of the companies and all of the institutes involved in these branches to take part. So, and this was not easy to communicate. And if we ask all the companies by the Chamber of Commerce, for example, in Berlin and in Brandenburg, do you know about cluster strategy in your area? You will have positive answers of about maybe 15%, because this is the core. This is the core we reach with our activities, and this is the core of companies that are very much interested in innovation, in future developments, and in cooperation. So, and we always have a discussion with, or not that much today, but in the past, with other stakeholders. For example, with the Chamber of Commerce, who have the feeling that so many companies are excluded from your activities. So you need to have a balance between reaching everybody and doing something for everybody versus concentrating on those who are really willing to contribute to a cluster. And this is the kind of conflict we still have, but that was bigger at the beginning.
Good. No? Do we have any questions from? Okay.
No.
So I think, please put in some questions. We'll add them more, and we'll move on because we'll come back, and Thomas and Stephen is also going to be on the panel. We'll have time there after the break. So thank you very much, Thomas.
Okay.
So now we're going to move from being in one continent to another continent. Now we're getting into the third continent. And our final destination on this global tour is San Diego. And please welcome up on stage Mary Walshok. She's a professor and the Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Programs and Dean for the UC San Diego Extension, the University of California, San Diego. Welcome, Mary.
So, I have very data-rich slides, which you can all have. So we're going to speed date through my slides. But what I'd like to do, because I come from the land of fruits and nuts, California, I want to share with you 4 big principles that I think are very different than we encounter in Europe, and now I realize is happening in Asia. The first is, jag är en svenska flicka, du förstår. And my uncle worked for Olof Palme, so I have good social democratic roots, all right? And by US standards, I'm a liberal. But by your standards, I'm going to sound like a Republican. Because the hardest thing for me to learn as a young Swedish graduate student, Swedish-American graduate student in sociology, was that wealth is not a dirty word. It is in Scandinavia. And my father used to tell me, growing up in California, oh, those people show off. Those people are trying to impress us. I thought we were poor because we couldn't show off. And then I discovered my father had a great deal of money and had done very well. But he chose to spend his money and use his money collecting antiques, going to Europe, doing very different things. No pink Cadillac, no fancy house, but a fancy house full of Chinese, a modest house full of Chinese porcelain and Georgian silver. That was not wealth. But in America, people think, wow, you have all these expensive things. So why do I say that? Because when regions, and I'm really speaking to you because I work very closely with a lot of political figures and currently the mayor of San Diego, good jobs and wealth creation, that's the goal. And if a community sees that innovation is the path to good jobs. And that means well-paid jobs, because well-paid jobs means you can buy a house, you can buy a car. It means you can eat in a restaurant. It means you can keep the economy churning. And that's a very high priority. So I think it's important when we think about the history of the cities across California, and I've done a lot of work in Seattle. Civic leaders, political leaders, are always focused on wealth for reinvestment and good jobs for regional prosperity. The second principle, and I said it to Steve, and I decided I'm going to say it to the group. In America, the government is seen in a very different way. It's a hugely important part of the innovation system, but it's a customer. It is an investor in research, science, and technology, and it's an enabler in terms of public policies like land use, water, housing costs, labor costs, taxation. It is not an orchestrator. It is not a manager. It does not run programs. So in a moment on my slides, you'll see all these organizations in San Diego. I'm amazed at how much money the government has given you, Stephen. All the organizations in San Diego that incubate companies that support innovation and entrepreneurship are privately funded. They're funded through memberships. They're funded through foundations, occasional grants for special projects. But government plays a very... And Magnus knows I'm writing a book with Orion Sovil right now at the Stockholm School of Economics, and we're really going to elucidate this because government's really important in the US, just like it is here, but in a different way. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's my third big point. Well, no, actually, that's my second big point. My third is the speed dating slides are a story of how San Diego, with government as the customer for military technology, and then eventually software and satellite communications and composite materials and alternative energy, fueled the growth of an innovation economy. It was tied very much to the military, and how the whole business sector pivoted from being real estate and local companies to patent attorneys, and I'm going to show you some numbers. Patent attorneys is my favorite number. And it created a whole different business culture. And so my fourth general point is today, and I've convinced our mayor, innovation is not a project. It's not a sector. It's our DNA. Whether we're innovating by creating price clubs or microbreweries or beautiful clothing or new wireless apps in health medicine, we're an innovator. So here are the quick slides, and I got to figure out which button do I push. Does that do it? No. There we go. So San Diego's history, no master plan, and still no master plan. Economy deeply tied to the US military, and a number of decisions in the 1950s, long before innovation was in style, but they were land use decisions. And the zoning of significant portions of land for light industry and R&D, which we thought would keep the military, were important. The growth of the research infrastructure in the post-World War II science community, you only wanted the best. So when the city decided it wanted a new university, my university, which only opened in the 1960s, they started by hiring full professors from Princeton and Chicago who brought their grants, their graduate students, and their postdocs with them. That's what a university is, not an undergraduate college, but a graduate institution, because that began to develop the seed corn. But boosters and champions, the civic culture, which will be another chapter in the book, Orion and I are writing. And that's why I'm so delighted. I feel so privileged to be here and to be with you. Because when elected officials, when community leaders and volunteers some of whom own department stores or used car lots, understand that innovation is the engine for growth, things start to happen. And finally, the cultural openness to risk-taking and collaboration are extremely important. So let's go through some of the data. Our story sort of starts in the 1960s, and again, I'm going to be very, very quick. But the reason I think it's important in this context is that our most significant history really begins in the 1980s with the establishment of a couple of companies, and Hybritech, which is sort of the godmother of the life sciences cluster, and Qualcomm, which began as a government contracting company. And so, again, I'll share that with you. Research is a huge component of what we do. That's the library on my campus. A small world story. My Swedish mother went to California to be an au pair. The man who designed this library was the little boy she took care of. And she couldn't get over that. Okay, so let me see. How am I suddenly have lost this. It's not moving. Could you help me? I want to give you some quick numbers. Here. Okay, this one. All right. So today there is about 1.26 billion in U.S. government and R&D. In our region, it's about 3 million people. And that's just government funding. We estimate about 3 billion annually in the metropolitan region because of foundation and other sources. And it's important to understand that even though there are only 3 universities, there are a lot of independent research institutes, like the Salk Institution, that attract a great deal of money. You can see that in NIH funding, we trend above a billion in the region, and then you add to that NSF, NASA, other kinds of funding. It's very, very significant. Again, all of these I'm happy for you to keep. The main thing is about $1 billion in research funding. We're number 5 in the United States. My campus, just my campus, is number 5 in the United States. That's Stanford, Harvard, Chicago, Princeton, Berkeley, UC San Francisco. We're a very productive campus. Our medical school alone, again, this is public money, gets $577 million in research funding. The medical school and clinic and hospital budgets this year are around $2.7 billion. And so it's a big force. And UC San Diego, my university, can track 650 companies over the last 25 years that have come out of one university. Patent applications and patents granted we were talking about metrics. These are metrics we keep every year, and this comes out of a report we prepare every year. And what it means is if you compare, say, we did a comparison with 3 cities that have great medical schools in the United States because of our medical focus. And you'll see that in San Diego, 36.6 patents per 100,000. In St. Louis, 11.8. In Philadelphia, fabulous city, great medical school, but the patenting is 1/3 of what it is in San Diego. A tech-based economy. The industry today, we have about 6,700 tech companies, and they are in various clusters. 11% of all the employment in the region is in technology companies, and those 6,700 are only 7% of all our companies. So we have a large agricultural economy, brewing, wine, sports industry, tourism, lots of other clusters, but the tech companies represent 23% of the total payroll in the region. And again, if you accept what I've just shared with you about what mayors and governors want, when you have high payroll industries, people purchase services in the other industries that are more local. And so lots of construction jobs, lots of automobile maintenance jobs, those sorts of things. The tech companies by industry sector, they cluster. As you can see that everybody thinks of us as a biotech hub, and to some extent that's true. It's about 34% of those 6,700 companies. But computers and electronics is hugely important. And with the convergence of wireless and software and healthcare and the environment, this mix of capabilities is very, very important to us. Nobody picked those clusters. Those clusters evolved out of projects that were pursued by scientists and engineers. We start about, on average, 400 technology companies a year. If you take restaurants started, clothing stores started, it's a couple thousand. But it means about every 18 hours, a new technology company is getting started. I've done work in St. Louis. They do about 45 companies a year in the tech sector, so 1/10 of what we're doing. And we also have data because of the ecosystem that supports these companies that twice as many of them succeed as typical startup companies in other cities, in part because of support mechanisms. And by population, I mean, look, San Francisco, Santa Clara, many cities are actually ahead of San Diego, but look at that list in California, a lot of startup activity. Risk capital, we call it venture capital. I love it that in Sweden it's riskkapital, and in English it's venture. Let's go on a journey, let's have fun, let's climb a mountain together, as opposed to, oh dear, we're getting very close, we could fall off, it's very risky. Let's put a little money in, you know? But I put risk capital on this out of respect for my Swedish heritage. And this gives you some sense. We're number 6 in the United States. I don't have that in this data in terms of venture capital and angel capital. Talent is a huge issue. And increasingly, our focus is on talent more than technology, if that makes sense. Because the talent will develop the technology, will develop the business platforms that can create the future. And so many of our strategies are around how to attract bright college graduates and PhDs to our region. You will see appalling statistics on America's high school graduation rates and California's. We are well behind many, many countries in Europe and Asia, except when you move in the direction of college graduates, and professional degrees. That somewhat reflects our social diversity. My office is 20 minutes from the Mexican border. Donald Trump is having a heyday in San Diego because large numbers of immigrants move back and forth across the border, and so that somewhat distorts our education data. Innovation economy employment, this is very important and maybe of interest to you. And I apologize for, I have the 2016 data, but I didn't have time to update my slides. But approximately 150,000 working in the tech sector. You'll be interested to see the wages that those command, which speaks to purchasing power. And it might be even more interesting for you to see where the mean and median are. But these are very good jobs, very good jobs. The tech clusters, there was no cluster strategy. Nobody picked, are we going to do this or that? Now, where there was strategy was research. So the research institutions lobby through the National Academy of Sciences and the state and the federal government. We need more money for cancer research. We need money for brain research. We need money on HIV/AIDS. We need money in renewable energy. And that's, again, now we're talking about where the government is playing a role, because there's a lot of activity in sort of picking areas of promise for basic research. But when it comes to cluster development, that's very much localized and organic may be too strong a word, but let me describe to you. Hybritech was founded in 1978. There were a handful of life science companies in the 70s. When I first came to the university, I was very young. And the good luck was that Lilly, a large pharmaceutical company, acquired these companies, and nobody wanted to work for large pharma. So all these guys that got bought out by Lilly, it sounds like Uppsala, huh? And Pharmacia said, I'm not going to work for this Midwestern bureaucratic pharmaceutical company. I'm going to start my own companies. And so today, there are actually more than 500 biotech and pharmaceutical companies, seeded by some of these early successes. And you would say, well, Mary, it wasn't a success. They were acquired. But our definition of success is the entrepreneurs and the talent stay. It's not about the companies, it's about the talent. And the talent reinvests in the next generation of companies. And over time, 400 or 500 pharmaceutical, smaller and mid-sized pharmaceutical companies represent a lot of good jobs and a lot of wealth creation. And there is a tendency to think we need the next Volvo, the next Qualcomm, the next Hewlett-Packard, but I'm not sure that's what we need in the 21st century. Similarly, and I've got begetting charts, and you can have those, so you can see how names reappear in 7 or 8 iterations of companies. And as I said, also the medical device industry is an important part of that. So when I say 450, that's pharma companies. 200, this additional 200 are what medical devices. And again, seeded by 1 or 2 companies in the 60s, and today they're more than 200. So you can have all of that. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. I apologize. So let's look at ICT. Again, you don't think of ICT as a strength in San Diego, but we're the center of the Pacific Fleet. And in fact, I say this with no pride. I'm a pacifist. I'm a Swede, for God's sakes. There's substantial increase in military investment in America. It's in R&D, and it's mostly on the West Coast, and a lot of it is in San Diego. So cybersecurity, composite materials, renewable energy, communications, a very, very important part. So the military still has a significant influence. But back in the 1970s and 80s, outside of large defense contracting companies, there were very few small companies. But today, there are over 1,000 in IT. And again, happy to have you look at these charts to see how names appear again and again. Defense cluster is still very big. That goes back to 1911. I wrote a book for Stanford, if you want to read about it, the roots of the innovation economy in the military economy. And not proud of it, it's just a fact. And today there are more than 260 aerospace, navigation, and maritime technologies. And actually the maritime cluster is one of our fastest, and who would have thought? Nobody expected it. A couple Navy guys and a retired admiral said, don't you realize all the companies that are developing around marine science? Clean tech and renewable energy, action sports. I actually dated a boy who had a real Woody. Do any of you remember those wooden station wagons from the 50s? You know, run, 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 run. Yeah, when the surf's up. And nowadays, it's all composite materials. And we have a professor at UCSD, I have to tell you, because this is what government can't plan. I have a good colleague, Stephen Metcalf. You can Google him. He works in the area which in English we call pond scum. It's green algae. He's my age. For 25 years, everybody thought Stephen was a fool. What on earth are you doing looking at algae? Well, today, he's a hero, right? Because algae is a source of renewable energy, and he's got all kinds of grants with the private sector and the government to run cars. But 2 other things is green algae is being used in. Baby formula for developing countries, and the residual materials are now being put inside surfboards instead of styrofoam. And Prince Andrew was with us 3 weeks ago, and we gave him a surfboard full of green algae byproducts. So you can't, how do you predict these things, right? These were surfer dudes in the 60s, and they become very interesting guys. Intermediary organizations, again, I'm going to do this really fast. It's a nightmare. But all of these activities intersect, and the government, economic development organizations, trade associations, particularly, and you all mentioned, incubators, accelerators, networking groups. A lot of coaching, mentoring, almost all of this is privately funded in the United States. It's not government funded, and it's not managed by government bureaucrats, but by not-for-profit organizations, and of course, networks. I want you to look at this. Another friend has written a book for Stanford comparing Los Angeles and the Silicon Valley, Michael Storper, S-T-O-R-P-E-R. And Storper talks about the fact that you did not get innovation economy in LA, other than in entertainment, and you got it in San Francisco. My colleague, Stephen Casper, says it may have something to do with networks. It's very fragmented in LA. It's very dense in San Francisco. And so clearly they matter. And I'm almost done, Magnus. Okay. No, I don't have to do any of this, right? All of these things you can read. And also our linkage to Tijuana. Again, I say this to Swedes because I've done a lot of work with Orion. Your connection to the Baltic is a huge strategic advantage, as is our connection to Mexico. 200,000 manufacturing jobs within 20 minutes of my office. Medtronics, Kyocera, Sony. In other words, high value-added manufacturing. It's not about cheap labor. Thermo Fisher has opened an incubator in Baja California. Thermo Fisher, a Boston-based company that acquired a San Diego company, has hired 300 engineers from Tijuana universities. So that linkage is important. So I get the award for the fastest talk with the most information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. I mean, I know you've been doing work in many other places around the U.S. and also elsewhere, both in Europe and in other parts of the world. What do you see as the common denominator for people to make sort of an innovative regional economy work?
I think it is, and everybody here has talked about this spontaneity and this bottom up. The thing I don't understand about the European or the Asian context, I only know the American context. When you take government money, you have to promise certain deliverables. And you can't predict what's going to come out. This is what experience tells us. Who would have thought that remote signal processing for airplanes and submarines would become the heart of the mobile telephony industry? But the CDMA platform that Irwin Jacobs developed was for the Navy. And then in the Viterbi algorithm. And now they're cell phones, but now they're no longer developing phones. They're developing medical apps, environmental monitoring apps. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that the common denominator in Seattle, in the Bay Area, in San Diego, in Texas, is lots of people experimenting on lots of different things. And when certain advantages perk up, people tend to mobilize around an advantage or an opportunity. And then you can get a little more strategic. It appears to me that it's certainly in the United States, the government asks you, what cluster are you going to develop? And it's hard to tell them that. But if you can say, we've got two areas of great strength, we think there'll be some convergence, we need some help to make this happen, then maybe, yeah.
Okay. And please use the app and put in some questions. We'll look at them during the break, because I'm forcing the program a little bit because, I mean, we have a time constraint to be able to have also Stephen Leonard part of the panel, because he has to move on to another city, London more specifically. So thank you very much, Mary, and I'll give some instructions for the coffee break.